to understand how a single airplane changed the course of the war in the Pacific. We must first understand why the United States Navy didn't want it. The year is 1942. On the flight deck of a testing carrier in the Atlantic, a new shape is screaming out of the sky. It does not look like the sturdy, reliable Wildcats that have held the line against Japan. It looks like a predator bred for pure speed. It has inverted gull wings that bend like the elbows of a bird of prey. It has a nose that stretches 12 feet in front of the cockpit. And on the front of that nose is the largest propeller ever bolted onto a fighter plane. 13 feet of Hamilton standard steel. Powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. This is the F4U Corsair. And in 1942, it is the most dangerous machine in the American arsenal, dangerous to the enemy, but even more dangerous to its own pilots. As the test pilot cuts the throttle to land, the tragedy of the Corsair's design reveals itself, that massive nose. The very thing that houses the engine that gives it speed, completely blocks the pilot's view of the deck. He is landing blind, guided only by instinct and the paddle-waving landing signal officer. When the wheels touch the steel deck, the plane doesn't stick. The shock absorbers are too stiff. The machine bounces. It porpoises into the air, slamming back down, sometimes drifting sideways, sometimes flipping over and tearing itself apart. The hydraulic fluid from the engine has a tendency to leak onto the windshield, blinding the pilot even further. The Navy brass watches this disaster unfold. They shake their heads. They call it the Ensign Eliminator, because a rookie pilot fresh out of flight school would have a life expectancy of about 30 seconds trying to land this beast on a moving ship. The Navy makes a decision. They choose the F6F Hellcat instead. The Hellcat is safe. It is forgiving. It is the Toyota Camry of fighter planes. The Corsair is a Ferrari with no brakes. The Navy deems the Corsair unfit for carrier duty. They mark it for the scrap heap of failed experiments. But the war in the Pacific is not going according to plan. The Japanese Zeros are still faster, more agile, and deadlier than anything the Americans are flying. The United States Marine Corps, the branch that always gets the Navy's hand-me-downs, looks at the rejected Corsair, and they see something the admirals missed. They don't care about carrier landings. Marines fly from dirt. They fly from crushed coral runways hacked out of the jungle on islands like Guadalcanal and Vella La Vella. They don't need a plane that lands softly. They need a plane that climbs like a rocket and hits like a freight train. They take the Corsair and they change history. This is not a story about a farmer flying a jet through the Panama Canal. This is the true story of how the Marines took a broken, rejected machine and turned it into the angel of death. They shipped the Corsairs to the Solomon Islands, not via San Diego and Panama, but across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific, carried on the decks of escort carriers and offloaded onto the hot, dusty airstrips of the South Pacific. Here, the Corsair was in its element, on the ground. It sat with a nose-high attitude that looked arrogant, aggressive, in the air. It was the first American fighter to break 400 miles per hour in level flight. The Japanese pilots, who had spent years mocking the slow American Wildcats, were about to face a rude awakening. They called it whistling death, because, at high speeds, the air rushing through the wing root oil coolers made a distinct, terrifying shriek that could be heard over the roar of the engine. But the plane had a learning curve written in blood. The Marine pilots had to learn to fly a machine that wanted to kill them. They had to master the torque of that giant engine, which was so powerful that if you slammed the throttle forward too fast on takeoff, the plane would flip over on its back and grind you into the runway. They had to learn to navigate over hundreds of miles of open ocean, with no landmarks, hunting for Japanese shipping and airfields, and the biggest target of all, the fortress that cast a shadow over the entire theater, Rabaul. Rabaul was not just a base. It was a shield of volcanoes and anti-aircraft guns on the island of New Britain. It was the stronghold of the Imperial Japanese Navy, protected by hundreds of A6M-0s. The best pilots Japan had left were stationed there, waiting for the Americans to come. The conventional wisdom said you bombed Rabaul from 20,000 feet. You stayed high. You stayed away from the flak. But the Marines in their Corsairs were not conventional. They were led by men who realized that the rule book was written for safer planes and safer times. Men like Major Gregory Boyington. And the subject of our story today, Lieutenant James Holloway. A man who looked at the Corsair's massive engine and realized it wasn't just for dogfighting, it was a sledgehammer. The stage is set. The year is turning to 1944. The Corsair has arrived. The pilots are sweating in the tropical heat of the Solomons, checking their guns, and looking north toward Rabaul. The Ensign Eliminator has found a home, and the Zeros are about to find out that the rules of engagement have just been rewritten. The geography of the war in February 1944 was not measured in miles. It was measured in blood. The Marine pilots of VMF 214 and other squadrons were not flying from San Diego. They were operating from the rotting, jungle-choked islands of the Solomons, places like Vella La Vella and Bougainville, islands that smelled of mud, decay, and aviation fuel. Their target was 300 miles to the north, the ultimate prize of the South Pacific, Rabaul. If you look at a map of New Britain, Rabaul sits on the rim of a massive volcanic caldera. It is a natural fortress, a harbor deep enough to hide the entire Imperial fleet, and ringed by 5 active volcanoes that spew ash into the air. But the Japanese had turned nature into a killing machine. They had dug 100,000 troops into the volcanic rock. They had established 5 airfields, and they had surrounded the harbor with the densest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery in the history of warfare. More than 300 heavy and light guns, ranging from the rapid-fire Type 96 25mm cannons to the massive Type 88 75mm heavy flak guns. The pilots called the sky over Rabaul the Black Cloud, because when the flak started bursting, it literally blotted out the sun. The standard American doctrine for attacking such a place was rigid. It was written in safety manuals back in Washington. It said, "Stay high. Bomb from 20,000 feet. Stay above the effective range of the light flak. And use your Norden bomb sights to hit the shipping in the harbor." But there was a problem with the doctrine. It didn't work. From 20,000 feet. A ship moving in the harbor was a tiny speck. The bombs drifted in the wind. They missed. They splashed harmlessly into the water. And while the Corsairs were up high, they were playing the game the Japanese wanted them to play. The Zero pilots loved the high altitude. Their lightweight planes could outturn and outclimb the heavy Americans in the thin air. Every time the Marines tried to bomb from high up, they were bounced by Zeros diving out of the sun. It was a meat grinder. The Marines were losing planes. They were losing men. And Rabaul was still standing. The harbor was still full of Japanese supply ships feeding their armies across the Pacific. Lieutenant James Holloway looked at the after-action reports. He saw the pattern of failure. He realized that the Corsairs were being used like clumsy, heavy bombers instead of the precision instruments they were. The F4U had an engine that produced 2,000 horsepower. It had a frame built like a bridge. It was heavy, fast, and incredibly stable in a dive. Holloway began to think about a different kind of war. A war fought not at 20,000 feet, but at 50 feet. He looked at the Japanese anti-aircraft guns. The heavy 75mm guns were designed to track high-flying bombers. They had slow traverse mechanisms. They couldn't track a target moving at 400 miles per hour just above the waves. And the lighter guns, the 25mm cannons, were terrifying but inaccurate against a target that appeared and vanished in seconds. Holloway realized that the safest place to be was not in the sky, but right down in the throat of the dragon. It was a suicidal idea, according to the manual, to dive a 6-ton fighter plane into a harbor surrounded by volcanoes, to fly so low that your propeller spray hit the water, and to drop a bomb not with a bomb sight, but by instinct, like skipping a stone across a pond. But the Marines were desperate. The high-altitude raids were failing, the Zeros were waiting, and the fortress of Rabaul seemed invincible. Holloway didn't know it yet, but he was about to invent a tactic that would turn the Corsair from a high-altitude interceptor into the most terrifying low-level striker of the war. He called it glide bombing. But the Japanese would soon have another name for it. The day the sky fell down, the briefing was simple. Forget the altitude. Forget the safety margins. We are going down to the deck. We are going to fly under their radar, under their guns, and right into their faces. The dragon was waiting, but the knights were changing their swords. The myth says that James Holloway flew like a farmer because he didn't know how to fly like a soldier. The truth is much colder and much more calculated. Holloway realized that the air war in the Pacific was governed by the laws of physics that the Japanese had mastered in 1941. But those laws were changing. The Japanese Zero was built like a kite. It was lightweight, agile, and unarmored. It relied on turning tightly to survive. The Corsair was built like a brick wrapped in aluminum. It weighed 12,000 pounds fully loaded. It couldn't turn with a Zero. But it could do something the Zero couldn't. It could retain energy. Holloway's logic was simple. If you fight a Zero at 20,000 feet, you are fighting in his backyard. The thin air favors his light wings. But if you drag him down to 50 feet above the water, the game changes. At sea level, the air is thick, dense, and turbulent. The lightweight Zero gets buffeted around like a leaf in a storm. But the heavy, powerful Corsair slices through the thick air like a cleaver. This was the foundation of the tactic Holloway proposed to his squadron. It wasn't just about flying low. It was about using the Corsair's massive Pratt & Whitney engine to act as a plow. The tactic was officially called masthead bombing or glide bombing, but the pilots called it mowing the lawn. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Instead of diving from high altitude at a steep angle, which gave the Japanese gunners time to track them, the Corsairs would approach the target flat, at full throttle. They would scream in at 350 knots, just feet above the waves. At this speed, the Japanese heavy flak guns were useless. They couldn't depress their barrels low enough. And the light machine guns couldn't traverse fast enough to keep up with the angular velocity of the passing plane. But there was a deadly problem with this tactic. If you drop a 1,000-pound bomb from 50 feet, the explosion will destroy your plane just as surely as it destroys the target. You would be caught in your own blast radius. Holloway's solution was the 4 to 5 second delay fuse, a small mechanical timer screwed into the nose and tail of the bomb. This would allow the bomb to smash through the deck of a ship or the roof of a bunker and sit there for 5 heartbeats before detonating, giving the Corsair just enough time to scream away from the kill zone. This was the crop-dusting move that the legends talk about. But it wasn't born from agriculture. It was born from engineering. Holloway gathered his pilots, young men who were terrified of the flak over Rabaul, and he told them, "We are going to stop being targets. We are going to become projectiles. We are going to use the weight of this plane to crush them." He explained that when a Zero tries to dive and follow a Corsair to the deck, the Zero's controls stiffen up at high speeds. The Japanese pilot loses the ability to roll quickly. Down on the deck, the Corsair is the king of speed. The Zero is just a spectator. The squadron practiced in secret, flying over the lagoons of the Solomons, cutting their wakes in the water, learning to judge altitude not by instruments, but by the spray on their windshields. They learned to ignore the instinct to pull up. They learned that safety lay in speed, and speed lay in staying low. The Corsair's inverted gull wing design, originally meant to accommodate the giant propeller, turned out to be perfect for this low-level violence. It kept the landing gear short and stiff, but in the air. The bent wing provided excellent stability in the thick tropical air. The Ensign Eliminator was about to become the Zero Eliminator. The date was set for the raid on Rabaul. The intelligence reports showed that the harbor was packed with shipping, and the airfields were lined with fighters. The Japanese were confident. They had repelled every high-altitude attack for months. They thought the Americans were predictable. They thought the sky belonged to them. They had no idea that a group of mud marines had decided to change the battlefield from the clouds to the waves. Holloway looked at his men. He saw the fear, but he also saw the trust. He climbed into his cockpit. The massive engine coughed to life, spitting blue smoke. He didn't look like a farmer. He looked like a man who had figured out the combination to a safe. And inside that safe was the destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The logic was sound. The physics were undeniable. Now, all they had to do was survive the most heavily defended airspace on Earth for 18 minutes. The silence broke at exactly 0900 hours, as the squadron of Corsairs roared over the lip of the crater at Rabaul. The sky turned black instantly. The Japanese gunners threw up a wall of steel so dense that pilots later swore they could smell the cordite through their oxygen masks, but Holloway didn't flinch. He pushed his throttle past the deton into war emergency power. The water injection system kicked in, adding 300 horsepower to the massive engines. The Corsairs surged forward at nearly 400 miles per hour, skimming so low over the harbor that the Japanese heavy gunners were helpless. They frantically cranked their handles to lower the barrels, but the American planes were already underneath their firing arc. Then came the Zeros. 11 of Japan's finest pilots dived from the clouds, expecting the Americans to panic and pull up into a dogfight. This was the trap. If the Marines pulled up, they would bleed off their speed and become sitting ducks for the agile Zeros. But Holloway had drilled his men well. They ignored the Zeros on their tails. They trusted in the physics of speed. They drove their Corsairs straight at the enemy shipping. The Zeros tried to follow them down into the thick air, but as the speed increased, the light controls of the Japanese fighters stiffened. They couldn't aim. They couldn't turn. They were shaking violently in the turbulence of their own speed. Holloway lined up on a Japanese destroyer. He didn't use a bomb sight. He used instinct and geometry. At 50 feet, he pickled the bomb. The 1,000-pound weapon skipped off the water once, then slammed into the side of the ship's hull just above the waterline. Holloway pulled back hard on the stick. The G-forces crushed him into his seat as the Corsair leaped over the ship's mast. 5 seconds later, the delay fuse triggered. A massive geyser of water and steel erupted behind him, breaking the destroyer's keel. The Zeros were now in a panic. They were chasing ghosts. Every time they tried to line up a shot, the Corsairs would simply outrun them or slash back with a burst of their 650 caliber machine guns. The Whistling Death lived up to its name. The sound of the Corsairs screaming through the harbor caused chaos among the ground crews. It was 18 minutes of pure, unadulterated violence. The Marines destroyed ships, they strafed the float planes sitting in the water, and they torched the fuel depots on the shore. When the Zeros finally managed to get into position, the rugged construction of the Corsairs saved them. One Marine pilot took a 20-millimeter cannon shell through the wing, in a zero. That would have been fatal. In the Corsair, the plane simply shuddered and kept flying. The heavy armor plate behind the pilot's seat stopped the machine gun bullets that would have killed a lesser man. Holloway led his squadron out of the harbor, staying low, using the smoke from the burning ships as cover. They didn't lose a single plane to the Zeros that day. They had walked into the Dragon's mouth, kicked out its teeth, and flown away before the Dragon knew what happened. The Japanese pilots were left circling in the sky, furious and confused. They had been beaten not by a better dogfighter, but by a machine that refused to play by their rules. The myth of the Zero's invincibility was broken, not by high-altitude duels, but by a group of Marines who dared to fly at the speed of heat at the height of a palm tree. War is experienced through the senses: the smell of burning oil, the taste of copper in your mouth, the vibration of the ground. But for the Japanese garrison at Rabaul in early 1944, the war became defined by a single sound. It was not the deep rumble of the B-17 bombers, nor was it the high-pitched whine of their own Zeros. It was a sound that had never been heard before in the history of aviation, a terrifying, multi-tonal shriek that sounded like heavy fabric being torn apart by a giant hand, or a banshee screaming directly into your ear. This was the auditory signature of the F4U Corsair, and it was accidental. The engineers at Vought had designed the massive wing roots to house the oil coolers and the supercharger intakes. They were interested in thermodynamics, not acoustics. But when the Corsair dived at 350 knots or flew at treetop level, the air rushing into those intakes created a harmonic resonance, a high-velocity whistle that announced the plane's arrival seconds before the bullets hit, to the Marine pilots inside the cockpit. Encased in their leather helmets and deafened by the roar of the 2,000-horsepower engine, the sound was barely noticeable, but to the Japanese soldiers on the ground, it was the sound of the apocalypse. We must pause to understand the psychological weight of this moment. Imagine standing on the edge of an airfield, watching the sky, and hearing that sound rise from a low moan to a deafening shriek. You know that the machine making that noise is heavily armored, faster than anything you have, and is flown by men who are no longer afraid of you. The nickname Whistling Death was not invented by American propaganda. It was found in the diaries of dead Japanese soldiers. It was a confession of fear. By March 1944, the tactic of low-level glide bombing had changed the complexion of the siege entirely. The Japanese commanders at Rabaul faced a crisis that their Bushido code could not solve. Their Zeros were being slaughtered on the ground before they could even start their engines, if they managed to take off. They were dragged down to the deck and shredded by the heavy Corsairs. The fortress that was supposed to project power across the Pacific had become a prison. The supply ships stopped coming. The harbor, once a bustling hub of the Imperial Navy, was now a graveyard of sunken hulls and oil slicks. The farmer tactics of James Holloway had stripped away the enemy's greatest advantage, their altitude, and replaced it with the Corsair's greatest strength, brute force. Lieutenant Holloway flew mission after mission during this period, and he began to notice a change. In February, the sky was black with flak. By April, the guns were falling silent. The Japanese gunners were no longer rushing to their weapons when they heard the whistle. They were rushing to their bunkers. The aggression had been beaten out of them, not just by the bombs, but by the sheer hopelessness of fighting a machine that ignored their defenses. There is a specific moment that defines this shift. On a morning patrol, Holloway led his flight over the main runway at Rabaul. He looked down, expecting to see Zeros scrambling to intercept. Instead, he saw nothing. The runways were empty, the hangars were closed. The Japanese had withdrawn their remaining air power to Truk Lagoon. They had abandoned the sky over Rabaul. The fortress was still there. The 100,000 troops were still there, digging deeper into their tunnels. But they had been castrated. They were no longer a threat to the Allied advance. They were simply prisoners on their own island, waiting to starve. The Corsair, the plane that the Navy had rejected because it couldn't land on a carrier, had done what the entire Pacific Fleet could not do. It had neutralized the Dragon of Rabaul, and it had done so not by flying high and safe, but by getting down in the mud, by flying at 50 feet, by turning the sky into a ceiling of whistling death that no enemy dared to challenge. The Marines had proven that the manual was wrong. They proved that a defective plane in the hands of desperate men is more dangerous than a perfect plane in the hands of men who follow the rules. As Holloway turned his squadron back toward the Solomons, the sun glinting off the bent wings of his Corsair, he wasn't thinking about farming. He was thinking about the silence he left behind, the silence of a conquered fortress, the silence of a winner. The Ensign Eliminator had finally found its purpose. It didn't need a carrier deck. It just needed a pilot brave enough to trust the physics of speed over the safety of altitude. Rabaul was effectively dead, and the Corsair was the nail in its coffin. By the summer of 1944, the guns of Rabaul were still pointing at the sky, but there was nothing left to shoot at. The campaign to neutralize the fortress of New Britain had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of the Allied commanders. They never had to launch a bloody amphibious invasion. They never had to send Marines to die on the beaches of the volcano. They simply strangled the fortress from the air until it withered and died. The architect of this strangulation was not a general sitting in a comfortable office in Washington. It was the collective genius of men like James Holloway, who looked at a broken plane and saw a weapon of mass destruction. The tactic of glide bombing, or mowing the lawn, did not just destroy the Japanese shipping in the harbor, it destroyed the very idea of static defense. The Japanese realized too late that sitting inside a fortress was a death sentence when the enemy could fly through your front door at 400 miles per hour. The F4U Corsair, the plane that the Navy had tried to throw away, had proven itself to be the most versatile platform of the Pacific War. It had started its life as the Ensign Eliminator, a machine that killed its own pilots on carrier decks. But it ended the Rabaul campaign as the Angel of Okinawa. The Marines had proven that the Corsair's rugged frame and massive engine made it the perfect fighter-bomber, a role that would define American air power for the next 3 decades. The Navy, watching the success of the Marines from the sidelines, finally admitted their mistake. By the end of 1944, the Corsair was cleared for carrier duty. It returned to the ships not as a dangerous experiment, but as the returning king. It would go on to clear the skies over Japan and protect the fleet from the terror of the kamikazes. But the true legacy of the farmer story is not about the machine. It is about the mindset. The legend that Holloway was mocked for flying like a crop duster is a simplification of a much deeper truth. In war, innovation often looks like madness to the untrained eye. When Holloway flew at 50 feet, he wasn't breaking the rules for the sake of rebellion. He was breaking them because the rules were getting his men killed. He understood that the manual is a guide, not a suicide pact. He treated the airspace over Rabaul not as a duel of knights, but as a grim harvest. He applied the cold logic of physics to the chaotic emotion of combat, and in doing so, he saved countless lives. Today, Rabaul is a quiet place. The volcanoes still smoke, and the jungle has reclaimed the runways where the Zeros once stood. If you walk through the undergrowth, you can still find the rusted skeletons of Japanese anti-aircraft guns, their barrels pointing uselessly at a sky that has been empty for 80 years. They stand as silent monuments to a battle that changed the way wars are fought. The Corsair is gone too, replaced by jets and missiles and drones. But the spirit of the Mud Marines lives on. It lives in the philosophy of close air support, the idea that the pilot's job is to get down in the dirt with the infantry, to be close enough to see the enemy's eyes, to be a terrifying, screaming presence that breaks the enemy's will to fight. James Holloway and his squadron didn't just win a battle. They rewrote the doctrine of aerial warfare. They proved that sometimes to reach the highest level of excellence. You have to fly at the lowest possible altitude. The farmer didn't just dust the crops. He burned the field so that nothing poisonous could ever grow there again. And as the history books closed on the Pacific War, the name of the F4U Corsair was written not in the ink of a failed test report, but in the gold letters of a legend. The whistle has faded, but the echo remains.